You are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Ali Abunama here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. And joining us today is the journalist and author Peter Oborne. He is associate editor of Middle East Eye and a columnist for Declassified UK. He's previously worked for The Spectator, The Daily Mail, The Daily Telegraph, and others. And his books include two Sunday Times bestsellers, The Assault on Truth and The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam. His new book, which has just come out, is called Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. And in it, Peter writes, a full reckoning with Britain's culpability for the destruction of Gaza requires an assessment of the failing institutions that misgovern British public life. The dishonesty of the media, the moral bankruptcy of the foreign policy establishment, growing domestic authoritarianism, the corruption of parliament, and the collapse of a party system increasingly manipulated by special interests and the super rich. It sounds like Peter could be describing any of a number of countries that many of us live in, but we're going to talk about all of this now with him. Peter, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
It's a great privilege to appear on Electronic Intifada. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Peter, thanks for coming.
I've been a long-time reader of your work, and you're one of the few voices in what we might call British mainstream media who've taken on this issue with such consistency. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for that, Peter. And in your book, you explain how really united all of Britain's main political parties are, including the right-wing Reform Party, which is now leading in many polls. They've been united in support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Prime Minister, on October 7th, 2023, visited soon after those events, offering support for the Israeli government. Yet, as you write in the book, you write, even before his arrival, he'd sent the message to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel could rely on Britain's unequivocal support. This amounted to carte blanche for the Israeli authorities to commit, with Britain's blessing, whatever crimes they wanted. Britain had already deployed a Royal Navy task force to the Eastern Mediterranean, including a company of Royal Marines, 2 ships and 3 helicopters. British surveillance aircraft also began to patrol the region. And Keir Starmer, then the leader of the opposition, of course, now the prime minister, was also in lockstep with Israel, infamously saying, quote, I think Israel does have the right, when asked by a radio journalist if it was appropriate for Israel to cut off power and water to Gaza. There are many other examples I could give, but what are your thoughts on why the British political establishment has been so important to Israel, and what led to you to write specifically about British complicity? What makes that so notable?
Well, do you know, I was in Nablus, but it wasn't exactly a year ago on the West Bank, in one of those beautiful ancient Ottoman houses in the old city, sitting on a terrace, looking at the sky and those stars. And I suddenly realized I had to write this book, because I'm a British by training and many years a political journalist in Britain. I understand, reporting domestic politics, but I understand and have deep knowledge of British domestic politics. I've also reported for Middle East Eye now for almost 10 years on the Middle East, so I have that understanding as well. I've also written 2 books about political lying, both under Tony Blair in New Labour at the time of the Iraq War, and also I've also wrote one about Boris Johnson when he was the Conservative Prime Minister, and I've also presented a film for Dispatches in Channel 4 on the pro-Israel lobby in this country. I realized putting all those four things together gave me an understanding, which gave me actually almost, I felt, a duty to write the book, because I felt that I could bring together the politics, the foreign policy, and of course the deceit, which has been a major part of the whole story.
And Peter, just before we came on air, we're going to talk later in the program more about Zohran Mamdani. But before we came on air, you made a comment about Zohran Mamdani. You said if he were in the UK, he would likely have been expelled from the Labour Party. I just wanted to bring that up and ask you to comment on it.
Yes, it's very interesting, this, because we're now having in Britain, where the Labour government is the government here, takes a very pro-Israel position, and also generally right-wing and anti-Muslim in a particular, it doctrinally goes after Muslims. And I saw some of our ministers celebrating Mamdani, but the fact is that, so this is offensive, because if you study the history of the last few years here in Britain, I'm sure most of your viewers haven't done that, but if you do, you know that Mamdani would have been expelled from Labour had he been a progressive Labour politician. And and so Labour can't learn any lessons. The Labour government, which is rotting in the polls, collapsing in the polls in Britain, facing political crisis, because it's turned its back on the progressive element of British voters repeatedly. And so Mamdani would have been running against them, the Labour Party, in the same way, if he was British, in the same way, of course, in the States, he's been running against the bankrupt liberal democratic establishment.
Well, let's get into your assessment of the vast support of the UK to Israel, especially in the last 2 years. In your book, you get into the figures. You detail the long-term British military support for Israel long before, of course, October 7th, 2023. Excuse me, you write, the UK licensed arms sales to Israel worth £488 million, approximately $600 million, between April 2015 and September 2023. This sum includes technology for military radars, components for targeting equipment, and components for military aircraft. But as you explain, this figure is an underestimate. Lay out for us how you put together this research, what your assessment is, and what it says about the UK's military support.
Yeah, I put together the research, and it was not my research. I should absolutely say that. I was relying, but not on the British mainstream media either, which have been negligent in exposing or just explaining this very important area. I was drawing on the website Declassified in London, who've done phenomenal work. Mark Curtis, Matt Kennard, and others. And I was also relying on, say, Al Jazeera has done some good work. I can't claim that I was pilfering. I don't want to claim the credit which I don't deserve. But the very important point is that the exposures of, and let's go through what they were, the nature of the arms sales by Britain, the fact that they continued, even though Israel has been committing one war crime after another, and therefore they actually selling arms to Israel by the British government, both the Conservatives and later Labour, is in breach, in my view, very heavily in breach of British law, which says you shouldn't sell arms to a country which is breaking international humanitarian law, which is the polite term for atrocities. And so that's one element of it. Then we have the other element, of course, the British military base in Cyprus, which is from where these surveillance flights have been going day after day after day. Doing what? We're not exactly certain what exactly they say. They're looking for hostages, but that's incredible. what have they been really doing? What have they been supplying intelligence to Israel? Then I looked at the diplomatic support given by Britain to Israel, blocking of the early, helping to block the early ceasefire resolutions, which was at a time early on when, you know, the assault was on civilians was disgusting. It was, you know, hundreds of people were being killed every day, civilian infrastructure targeted. You know, 5,000 people were dead by the end of the month. I mean, it was by January, just 3 months, 20,000. You know, as you all know, whole families being wiped out, carnage, and Britain was British government was blocking a ceasefire. These are various ways. There's other things we should talk about, the military cooperation and so on. But that is Britain's complicity. That is part of Britain's complicity in what most scholars and experts now regard as a genocide.
And of course, the political cover. I mean,
Yes.
Palestine for the last 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, of course, has been carved up, just as other parts of West Asia have been carved up by the British Empire. How do you see, the foundations of the Zionist colonization of Palestine, and the responsibility that the UK and Britain still holds in terms of laying the groundwork for the complete destruction of Palestinian land?
Well, the Balfour Declaration in 108 years ago, Britain gave Palestine to the Zionist movement, and then administered the sort of the arrival of Jews into Palestine during the mandate period, and then were basically driven out of Palestine by Jewish terrorists. Just after World War II. But we do bear a very heavy responsibility, because we did give, even the Balfour Declaration gave a guarantee of a promise of civil rights to Palestinians, and so we have that responsibility. And for many decades after World War II, in many ways, we actually honored that responsibility. I examined the conduct of post-war British governments, Labour and the Conservatives, and Britain was ready to really censure and punish successive Israeli governments for when they committed atrocities. Maggie Thatcher's a very interesting study. She would not, after Sabra and Shatila, the attack on South Lebanon, after Bushehr, I think it was the attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor. She was ready to cancel arms sales and use very strong language like barbarism against Israel. I unearthed this fascinating interview between a Jewish chronicle journalist, I think he was called Monty Modlin, and Maggie Thatcher. He accused her of betraying Israel, and she gave him this lecture which really resonates. Look, Israel was breaking international law. International law is all we have. Very famous, very strong, swinging her handbag. Now, she's not thought of as being a friend of Palestinians, and she wasn't. But and she's also a hate figure to the left, and there are reasons why. But she understood the importance of the institutions, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court as it was emerging, and international law, which guaranteed free right, was meant to guarantee and promise human rights for all, equal and equality, in a way which current generation of leaders seem completely oblivious to.
You write about that in your book, Peter, about Margaret Thatcher. Of course, A lot of people would not see Margaret Thatcher as a hero by any measure, particularly given her close association with Ronald Reagan and support for US wars around the world, her policies with regard to Ireland and so on. But that's the point, that someone like that could still say things that are unimaginable now. I remember in the mid-80s, I remember this quite well. At the time, I watched these things very closely. Margaret Thatcher visited Jordan, and she went to a Palestinian refugee camp there. And she actually mingled with Palestinian refugees and spoke to them and addressed them. And it just seems unthinkable now, even to imagine Keir Starmer going to a Palestinian refugee camp. What do you think explains this shift? I mean, I know that that's what your book is about, but what do you think explains this complete collapse of any sort of moral compass or fiber across the British political spectrum? And even on the left, you used to have figures like Tony Benn. Where are the Tony Benns today?
Right. Well, first answer about the Tony Benns, they've been expelled from the Labour Party. Simple as that. Anybody of that kind of, as I was saying earlier, Mamdani would have gone. He'd have been out of the Labour Party. By the way, it stretched even into the age of John Major, who succeeded Thatcher as Prime Minister. I remember going with John Major as a part of the press corps to Gaza with him when he met Yasser Arafat in, I think, 1995, in that hopeful moment in Israeli politics. And that is gone. And I think that to answer your substantive question there, I think there's two reasons. One is the rise of neoconservatism in the States, the ending of the United States as a claimant to be part of the rules-based international world order, and replacement by a view that there's good people, there's goodies and baddies, and I'm afraid that Palestinians in that framing are baddies. It's a lack of understanding of how the world is, and an abandonment of human decency as well. And this rise of the neocons happened with the arrival of Tony Blair, who repudiated that magnificent legacy he'd received from Benn and others, turned on the left. That in that way makes him the prototype for the current Labour Prime Minister, and took this policy that we have to be at all times in lockstep with the global hegemon, the United States of America. And that led to the calamity of the Iraq war and the illegal invasion of another country, leading to complete chaos, carnage, and 1 million deaths. At the same time, less important than this doctrine that Britain must do whatever America wants, whatever much of a cesspit it turns us into in terms of our moral status. The pro-Israel lobby, as I have a chapter on that in Britain, was very effective in forming alliances across the main political parties, getting its point of view across, and the Palestinians were just unable to compete with that. They simply, as I demonstrate in the book again and again, just weren't heard at Westminster.
So, I mean, at this point, I remember when British politics used to be interesting. I used to follow it closely, partly because of what I studied in university. This is debatable, but it seemed to matter which party was in power, or at least it seemed to matter to a lot of people. Does it really matter anymore? I mean, people vote, and there is no shift from Rishi Sunak to Keir Starmer, and at least in terms of this particular issue, which is a concern of a major part of the British electorate. You can't vote against genocide in the UK. You can't get an anti-genocide government by voting in the UK. Is that a fair proposition?
Well, it's not just that you can't vote against genocide. You can't actually mention it. It's banned as a term on the mainstream media, but also the Labour Party. I mean, you can't use that word. And so it is actually wider than Gaza. It's true of economic analysis and economic policy. There is, and one thing I want to add to this coalition, it doesn't just embrace Labour, which of course, which is supposed to be, or historically was, the party of the working classes. It doesn't just embrace the Tories. It also embraces the reform, the emergent far-right movement, and it embraces the far-right, which I think is not often mentioned enough. Tommy Robinson and his racist thugs, they're very much as part of the same foreign policy analysis as Rishi Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer. And of course, we saw Tommy Robinson go to...
He's the leader of the so-called English Defence League. Sort of a far-right agitator.
A far-right agitator. He actually went to, I cannot tell you how shocking and appalling this was. He went to Israel just a couple of weeks ago as the guest of the Israeli government. It's quite an astonishing thing. I mean, Mr. But he does share, and he has been a very powerful advocate for Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich and co. Ever since October the 7th.
And of course, included in those assets is the media class in the UK, which has been providing political and propaganda cover for the Israeli government for a long time, of course, but kind of more consolidated and enhanced over the last 2 years. Your book also examines the complicity of British journalists with the genocide. You give an example in chapter 2. In January of 2024, 24 Israeli soldiers were killed in combat with Palestinian fighters in Gaza. The British media overwhelmingly took the side of Israel, of course, focusing on those deaths and mostly ignored the killings of Palestinian civilians by Israel in Gaza. You write, quote, "On the same day, almost 200 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. There were no headlines for these deaths. At most, they were noted in passing as part of daily roundup of events." Media professor Des Freeman found that media outlets used the phrase deadliest day 856 times between October 7th, 2023 and January 25th, 2024. Not one of those usages referred directly to evidence of Palestinian deaths. And you aptly summarize the performance of the UK media as so. British TV and radio studios are chock full of loudmouth presenters with big salaries but negligible understanding. Experts who have mastered the history of the Israel-Palestine dispute tend to be excluded from public discussion. What sort of experts have been excluded from that discourse, and what impact do you think that this coverage has had?
When you mentioned Des Freedman's fascinating analysis, and I think one of the points about this book, I'd just like to say here, I don't see it as me really being the author. I have drawn on the expertise, the knowledge of so many different people. Working for Middle East Eye, I've had an enormous privilege. I've drawn on Electronic Intifada's work. I've drawn on Haaretz, on 972. I've drawn on the selfless heroism of the journalists inside Gaza. Several of them are colleagues of mine. 2 of them have been killed. I've drawn on the wisdom of all kinds of people. So it's that, and so that Des Freedman there was an example. I do think that of somebody whose work I've plundered. Now, I do feel that it really upsets me. These people sitting in these studios in London, comfortable. I dare say they're on six-figure salaries. They really know nothing, but they know what they're expected to say, and and they pump this nonsense out because they don't understand what they're talking about. They don't have any real knowledge of the Middle East or anywhere else, I don't think, apart from they're creating clickbait. And I compare these people with the journalists in Gaza. They're not getting paid anything, I shouldn't think, hardly anything. But they're being targeted and killed. Their families are being killed. More than 200, I don't know the exact, have been killed. And these people, the journalists in Gaza, I compare them to the Western media, and it makes me feel ashamed.
I mean, obviously we see that here in the States as well, across the West. Those who are, platformed and given these enormous salaries are being put there because they have no actual historical analysis or political principle. They're there to parrot the State Department or the Foreign Office or, whatever politician is calling the shots. And that's what the West calls journalism. And yeah, you're right. The Palestinian journalists in Gaza are openly hunted. They are smeared and attacked. I'm just thinking about CNN's Christian Amanpour, who said over and over again over the past, I don't know, year and a half or so, there are no journalists in Gaza. What she meant is there are no international foreign journalists in Gaza, right? Completely like paving over the hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian journalists who have sacrificed their lives to bring this story of their experience of genocide to the world. And I think that's kind of how the media class, on the one hand, views what success means as a journalist, right? To be paid so much to know so little, and also how they think of Palestinians, specifically journalists, but Palestinians in general, the constant dehumanization, and this kind of notion that Palestinians can't tell their own stories. How do you, talk a little bit more about that and the shame that I think we should all feel, especially as journalists, watching this just cycle over and over and over again.
David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, said in Parliament, there are no journalists in Gaza. And he has never apologized for that or corrected. And that's what he meant. There are no foreign journalists. It is the way in which the Palestinian side of the story is obliterated. There's an organization in Britain, it's an offshoot of the Muslim Council of Britain called the Centre for Media Monitoring. It did a study of BBC coverage, and among the many other things it discovered was that only 6% of the deaths of journalists in Palestine have been covered by the BBC, whereas something like in Ukraine, where far less journalists have died, but I honor them, and I think it's approximately 20. That about 60% of them were covered. That's a sort of different standard, a racist standard, I think I would say, for covering of these things. And it's part of a sort of wider obliteration of Palestinian voices. One point really hits me is in Britain, we have basically the foremost global world historian of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. He's Avi Shlaim. I'm sure you know exactly who I'm talking about. He's amazingly distinguished, author of numerous books of great distinction. He's Jewish. He takes the he's extraordinarily learned. It's incredible that the BBC have simply not invited him on, apart from a short while for 2 years they didn't invite him on at all, even though there he was in Oxford, the emeritus professor of international relations. Ilan Pappé is another case in point. There he is, a enormously respected scholar. There he is in Exeter University. Again, the BBC won't have him on. And so these pro-Palestinian, and he's Jewish too. He's actually, I think he's an Israeli citizen. I think both of them served in the IDF. You'd have thought these were the most qualified people in the world to come on to British mainstream media, but of course and talk about the events of the last 2 years, but they're not invited on. And you can only assume that this is because they are anti-Palestinian. I mean, sorry, they are critics of the Israeli state.
Yeah, it's been, I would say, similar in the United States to the extent that any of us even watch mainstream coverage anymore. Although I'd say the BBC, I think, still plays a more dominant role in the UK than any one particular outlet does in the UK. And of course, it's supposed to be a public broadcaster that adheres to standards of impartiality. And we know that that is anything but the case. Peter, I want to sort of pan out a little bit. Your book, Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza, obviously focuses on the UK. But if we think about it, the phenomena you describe are really common across the West. With very few exceptions, all the governments of the West, all the governments aligned with the United States, have behaved pretty much the same way. Yes, there have been some signs of dissent from countries like Spain and Belgium. It's arguable how much that has added up to in reality. How much does your analysis apply to other countries? And what do you think explains this broad Western complicity in this genocide and this sort of across the board support for Israel? You alluded a little bit already to the rise of neoconservatism, but what are your thoughts about this if you think about it across a much broader geographical area?
I'm not an expert on the rest of Europe, but we've seen the disastrous position taken by the European Union, in where the most powerful state, beyond doubt, is Germany, which is still lacerated by its shame for the Holocaust. And very understandably so, and I can understand why it feels somehow it has an obligation to the Jewish state. I think that's specific to Germany, but also to the entire West as well, because I mean, anti-Semitism has been a poison in the West for more than in Europe, including Britain, for more than 1,000 years, and it's. I think there is a deep sense of obligation to Israel for that reason. I also think that I think I discussed that actually, that the United States is the dominant partner in all of this. That the British, there is made this calculation in the chancelleries of the West that that we have to cleave to the United States, and of course the United States has been the primary partner and collaborator in what almost all experts, or majority of experts now say, is a genocide. And so I am interested. I am interested in changing public opinion in Europe, including Britain. Spain, I take seriously. I think something's happening there, really interesting. Ireland as well. The people on the streets. I was talking to a Palestinian activist recently. He'd been in Genoa, in Italy, and he said the mood is changing. He had 300,000 people on the streets there, and there is a sense of horror at Western complicity in this genocide.
I think we see that, and of course that distinction between people and governments, which also points to this sort of gap in democracy that you write about when it comes to Britain. Peter, final question: do you think the BBC will be inviting you on to talk about this tremendously interesting and important book?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, if you read the book, I'm not particularly polite about the BBC, although I think it's important to say that I don't think that some of their Middle East correspondents, I think some of them are very good, but Jeremy Bowen and people like that, within the constraints they have to deal with. The BBC did do that Louis Theroux terrific documentary about the West Bank, which really opened people's eyes. And so I'm not going to criticize the BBC totally.
Although they've just thrown him under the bus, isn't that right, Louis Theroux, after a complaint from the Board of Deputies?
Because he interviewed Bob Vylan. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
just in the past few days, because he'd done a podcast interview with Bobby Vylan, the musician, Vylan, the musician who'd chanted about the IDF. I don't dare say it on YouTube because I don't want us to be taken off air. But the Board of Deputies made a complaint, and the BBC responded with a statement saying, "Oh, we currently have no projects with Louis Theroux," and distancing themselves from him. So that's the way the cookie crumbles, as they say.
Well, anyway, there has been some decent reporting on the BBC. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't want to be too crude in our analysis of, on our condemnation of Western media. There have been some standout performances. But Channel 4 has been quite extraordinary. Its reporting has been excellent, gets better actually, if anything. And there has been one or two good respectable pieces of journalism in the mainstream media.
And that I would say is true also in the US or internationally. I mean, increasingly the media market, so-called mainstream Western media, is one market. It's no longer sort of segmented by country as much as it used to be. At least that's the impression I have. And there are always exceptions. But I think what your book does so well, and I haven't read the whole thing, but the sections I did read focused on the media, and I found that analysis to be really damning of the BBC and other outlets in terms of the overall patterns and picture that you point out. But I think it's fair to say there are always exceptions. Sadly, they tend to prove the rule that on the whole, the coverage has been pretty awful. Peter, this is a really fascinating and interesting book. I hope lots of people will read it. I hope that you will have lots of opportunities to talk about it and to educate people and raise awareness, and to keep the issue of Gaza and the genocide and Palestine more generally in the limelight. And we're so grateful to you for coming on today to talk about the book. Again, it's called Complicit: Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. It is out now. People can get physical copies, but I think that the ebook is available pretty much anywhere in the world already. So if people are impatient to get their hands on it, there's no reason to wait. And again, Peter, we're very grateful to you for coming on and talking to us about this today.
Well, thank you very much. Can I say one more thing? I just want what is this has been. You're talking about mainstream media, but there have been some alternative media, as we might call them, have really risen to the occasion, and actually some of the Israeli. Plus 972 is a magazine, and Haaretz, a lot of its reporting has been very formative in how we understand this terrible situation. And so there have been some heroic reporting, but of course, the people we honor most and admire most and are the Palestinian journalists in Gaza.
Yeah. That's right.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Thank you again, Peter, and we hope to have you
Peter.
back again. I feel like it's been too long for this to happen, and I hope we'll do it again soon.
Thank you very much.